In this video, I'm going to explain the contingent valuation method, which can be used to place a monetary value on different environmental attributes or ecosystem services or natural resources and so on. So let's get into it. So the contingent valuation method is what's called a stated preference valuation method within this category of stated preference. And that is different than what we've talked about so far. So far we've looked at the hedonic pricing method and the travel cost method. And those are both in this revealed preference category where they seek to determine these monetary values based on observing actual market behavior. So in the case of hedonic, we gave some examples about the influence of environmental attributes on property prices that we actually observe in the market. So we looked at house prices, and then we would do some regression analysis on the different factors that might influence them, including, for instance, their proximity to the beach or having a view and so on. So actual market data. Similarly, for the travel cost method, it was a survey method where we looked at how much were people paying in total to experience some kind of natural asset, or a park, or recreating on the beach and so on. So those are those revealed preference. So contingent valuation, on the other hand, is a stated preference method, and in this case we're asking people to directly state their preferences, their willingness to pay and so on, for an environmental improvement could be one possibility, or maybe how much would they be willing to accept in compensation for the loss of some type of environmental benefit. So it's more of a constructed market, a hypothetical situation that we're posing to people. So whereas revealed preference methods, so for instance those travel cost and hedonic pricing and so on, can only really measure use values, direct use values, the stated preference method, on the other hand, for instance like contingent valuation, can be used to estimate non-use values. And that's really important, as I'll explain in a minute. So just to recall that non-use values encompass things like option values. So think of that kind of like an insurance premium that people would be willing to pay to retain the option of the possible future use of a site. Bequest values, which represent people's willingness to pay for the preservation of natural assets for future generations. Existence value, which represent people's willingness to pay for preserving the environment and ecosystems in an intact, resilient, contiguous, high-quality state for its own value and for the value that it provides in terms of these ecosystem services, provisioning, supporting, maintaining types of services. So because people place quite a lot of value on these non-use values, if a valuation study only focused on use values, it would likely severely underestimate the preservation value that a lot of people put on these ecosystems, and that would underestimate the total value of whatever the natural asset is that we're interested in. And that would be especially true where people view that natural asset as being subject to uncertainty, for example, that it's unique and that any loss or damage to it would be irreversible. And that's probably especially true in the context of climate change. So the contingent valuation method then utilizes surveys to ask people hypothetical questions about their willingness to pay for ecosystem services. For example, maybe it's carbon sequestration or water purification. We might be asking them their willingness to pay for the preservation of a site, like a local conservation area. Maybe it's, Budrum, the local Budrum Waterfalls Park. Or it might be to ask them their willingness to pay for some change in environmental quality, for instance, an improvement in water quality in a local stream. We could also, on the other hand, ask people how much they would need to be compensated for the degradation of some environmental assets, so for the loss of those environmental values. Here's just a quick example before I get into the steps of how you do a contingent valuation study. So this particular one, This research looked at consumer willingness to pay for green space in Australian capital cities, so urban kind of context, and they examined the influence of public green space on life satisfaction of residents, and they found this positive relationship where people were more satisfied with their life when they had access to these green spaces, and they estimated that people were willing to pay about $1,172 in annual household income for a 1% increase, in this case 143 square meters of public green space. So that's kind of interesting. People place a lot of value on what is something that is publicly provided rather than something that they pay for on their own in the market. So, and this study also found, and this is where demographics are kind of interesting and get into it, is that they found that lone parents, for example, and less educated people benefit more, that is, would have a higher willingness to pay for the provision of public green space than the general population. And because green space is, a publicly provided good, we can draw conclusions and policy conclusions about if we were to dedicate a certain section of an urban area to green space compared to a shopping mall, we could estimate the value that people would be getting from that. And we could, in fact, do cost-benefit analysis and so on. So now let's look at the steps in conducting a contingent valuation study. So first off, we need to identify what the environmental good or service to be valued is, right? So for instance, is it, are we investigating a possible increase in public green space like we've just looked at there? Or perhaps it's the provision of renewable energy, or perhaps it's the protection of something like the interurban break between, on the outskirts of the Sunshine Coast region. Or maybe it's change in either the quality or the quantity of water in a situation. So first step is then to determine what is the actual environmental good or service or attribute that we're going to be investigating and, to determine people's monetary values on. The next thing we're going to have to think about is, well, who actually, whose values are we estimating here, right? So we should focus our study on the population that will be affected by the proposed change, those that are primarily using the natural asset. We might use, geopolitical boundaries such as city, region, or state kind of boundaries. For instance, if we're interested in some type of change that might affect the quality of water for recreational anglers, then the recreational anglers that would be using that site would be of particular interest to us. If we're interested in green space in urban centers, then it would be the population of people that would have that interaction with that location. So think about whose values it is, whose values are to be estimated in this investigation. Then we need to consider what kind of a data collection method we're going to use. So this is a survey, but we could conduct it in person. We might go down and with our clipboard and actually try to interview people directly who are on the beach angling for fish or somewhere else like that. So it could be an in-person survey, an interview. It could be a postal survey or a telephone survey or an email survey. So there's a lot of different options, and you can imagine that there would be different types of information you could present through images and discussion and so on in different formats. And also there would be different costs associated with implementing those survey methods. And we would probably expect, the potential to reach different population sizes with them. But there would also be differences in the response rate depending on what kind of survey we chose to use. Similarly, we'll need to figure out, well, how big of the sample, how big is our sample size? How many people are we actually going to try to survey in this? Now, one of the first steps, and when we actually design the survey, and especially thinking about how it will be delivered, is we need to communicate the situation to the people that we're actually asking for responses from. So we'll want to design this information in the survey to have, initially some upfront information and scenario component to the survey where we communicate that information. So that would include things like a description of the environmental service or the natural asset or the environmental attribute to be valued, an explanation of why we're doing this valuation exercise. So maybe there has been a policy proposal to use some local area, to take it from a green space into some other type of land use, and we're interested in, how much would people pay to retain it in its current state. So it's we need to explain to people why we're actually doing this valuation exercise. Then we need to present the changes to them in terms of the quality and the quantity of whatever change we're proposing there, and also its likelihood too. So some things might be, it's definitely on or off, but other things we might want to communicate the actual outcomes could be subject to things outside of our control. For instance, because of climate change, we think we'll achieve the following type of water quality improvement, but it's possible that, due to droughts and floods and so on, there's a 60% chance it'll happen and a 40% chance it won't. So we'll communicate that type of information. We also want to give background information on current service levels, before and after site attributes, existing or future levels of biodiversity, flora and fauna, current or future levels of access and amenity at the site. We'll want to explain how the change would actually occur. So how would this proposal be implemented in terms of the time frame, who would be responsible for actually making the change if it was some kind of an improvement to water quality, like who will actually be doing the work to implement that project, what might occur if the project didn't go ahead. We'd want to include photos and diagrams and maps and so on to inform people of the current situation, the proposed change. We'd also want to let them know about substitutes and alternative sites and services that are available, because people need to know, will the change be to the last remaining, one of these, or are there many other ones that they could benefit from, as well. And we want to remind respondents of their budget constraints and trade-offs, because we're going to be asking them hypothetically how much would they be willing to pay for something, a change or protection of something. But they need to, if they're going to give us a realistic answer, be reminded that they only have so much money and there's trade-offs. If they were to pay for this, they wouldn't be able to pay for other things that they might be interested in. So that's that upfront part of the survey where we develop that scenario and present people with enough information that they can provide us with an informed response. Next, we're going to want to establish in the survey what will be the actual mechanism for the payment, this hypothetical payment that they would make. For example, we might propose that it would be an increase in their income tax, an annual income tax increase, or it might be a land tax, or included in the GST. It could be an increase in fees for access or use of a site if maybe there's, we're proposing that right now it's free and instead it'll be $10 of, a visit to access some local park. Or it could be maybe an increase in utility bills. It could be a voluntary donation. It could be a one-off charge or an ongoing payment. So we'll want to think about that, because that will influence people and their willingness to pay. So we'll need to know, as I'll explain more, we'll need to know by what mechanism are we proposing that this payment will be made. Then we'll actually need to have a format by which we allow respondents to indicate the actual dollar amount that they would be willing to pay for something. And there's a variety of different formats about how this can be presented. For example, in this little image that you see here. So one would be an open-ended format. This is perhaps the simplest thing, where we just say, simply, what is the maximum amount you would be willing to pay, annually or as a tax surcharge to fund a wetlands protection program in your local region. So that is, what would we get back? We wouldn't provide people with any numbers to begin with. They would just think in their heads and give us a dollar value. A second approach would be what's called a payment card format, and you can see this example here. And so in this case, people don't, they're limited in the number that they can actually circle here. For example, you notice 0 isn't on here, and there's nothing above 2,000 on here. So now we have a set of discrete choices that people have to make, and they would circle the one which best represents their willingness to pay. Then you have this other single bounded format. So here it's like, would you be willing to pay $75 annually as a tax surcharge to fund a wetlands protection program? Yes, no, unsure. So we're giving them a specific value, $75 in this case, and finding out simply if it's yes, no, or unsure. Or we could have this double-bounded format where we say, would you be willing to pay $75? And if they say yes, then we up the price and say, well, would you be willing to pay $150? And if they say no, then we drop the price and say, well, would you be willing to pay $40? So it's a different kind of method of determining, of eliciting their monetary response. And then you have this multiple bounded format, which kind of combines them together. So we would need to think about which one of these different, formats of payment we would be using in our survey, because, as I'll explain in a minute, it does have an influence on both the kind of econometric method we would use to analyze the data in the end, but also could influence people's responses. Okay, then finally we're going to have to think about what other additional information might we want to collect in the survey that could also be influencing people's willingness to pay. So we've talked previously in other lectures about how people's decisions to purchase certain products are dependent on their tastes and preferences and income and the availability of substitutes and so on. So for instance, age may affect people's willingness to pay, or the location that they live in, or their education levels and their awareness of situations, their income levels, their marital status. There could be a wide range of different possible demographic and socioeconomic conditions that would influence people's willingness to pay. So that's information that we, would likely be also interested in collecting at the same time, to know how those different demographic and socioeconomic conditions influence people's willingness to pay. Okay, and then finally we'll have to analyze the survey data that we collect and estimate either individual or household or aggregate willingness to pay. And this might include, upper and lower boundary values, mean, median values, and that type of thing, all these different kind of measures of range and central tendency. And we're also interested then in analyzing how demographic and socioeconomic conditions influenced people's responses or their stated willingness to pay. Okay, so I think it's worth just having a quick look at the math behind it. In the simplest response case, so this is just that open-ended response. If we ask people, how much would you be willing to pay for, and they give us a dollar value, whatever they come up with, that's probably in terms of calculating the simplest version. And simply what we do there basically is take the sum of all of the responses and divide it by the population to get the average or the mean willingness to pay. And depending on how we set up our study, it might be, that we're asking individuals. In other instances, we might be asking people to respond on behalf of their households if they can represent their households. And we do find in practice that there is some smallish differences between the outcomes that you get when you ask for individual versus household willingness to pay. So once we find out that average value, if that's what our interest is, or the median value, then we might aggregate that up to make inferences about the larger population that uses the resource and what their aggregate willing to pay for that might be. Now, I also mentioned that we'd want to collect demographic information. So in the previous videos that I produced on the hedonic pricing method and travel cost, I explained this basic kind of regression type of approach that we could do here. So here what I have is in a simple situation like the one I've just described there, where we have that respondents provide a willingness to pay response in just a single dollar, like in a dollar format of their own choosing. Then what we can do is we can look at for that same respondent and for that particular amount, their demographic characteristics and these other variables, and determine then what the influence of those are. So here in this equation I have, for instance, this is the willingness to pay of individual I, and we have some intercept and so on, and then we have this beta times yi. So yi is the annual household income of the respondent. Z is some vector, which is to say, there would be a variety of different, variables contained within this, socioeconomic, demographic kind of characteristics. So that might be age, education, other kinds of things there. And then we might have a vector of risk, so that might identify, different possibilities of it occurring or not occurring, and some other kind of perceptions about, like respondents' perceptions about risks there of outcomes, and then we would have some error terms. So we would use that, we would have a big set of data, and our willingness to pay that the respondents were saying would be the dependent variable, and then we would use a linear regression analysis or something similar like OLS to regress and look at the influence of each of these different variables, the income and socioeconomic data and so on the willingness to pay. And then we would be particularly interested in these parameter estimates that would come out of that. So for instance, this is a linear version of the whole thing. You may recall I've talked about linear, log linear, and linear transformations of this curve. But what this is saying is that beta 1 here, for example, would tell us, for every unit increase in annual income, in this case, what is for every dollar increase, presumably in annual income, what is the dollar increase in their willingness to pay? So that can be, interesting information to know too. That helps to explain why people are willing to pay more or less. Okay, so let's look at a few different example questionnaires here. So here's just two that I've pulled off the internet or out of textbooks. So the one on the left is just a section of the survey, and that particular willingness to pay survey, that contingent valuation survey, was investigating how much more would local people in Dominica be willing to pay for organic produce compared to regular produce. And so you can see here that they've got, the particular payment method that they're using, how much would you be willing to pay for an organic version of this product, and they give kind of ranges. So it's sort of like a bit of a payment card version approach there. Okay, and then on the other one here, you've got, this was a questionnaire about valuing the Kalamazoo Nature Center, which I believe is in Michigan, maybe, in the US. And so you can see here the types of different questions and the setup and so on. So the Kalamazoo Nature Center first of all, you can see that it's reminding people that one of many different recreational opportunities. So reminding them that their income is limited, and asking them just to do this valuation in the case of that Kalamazoo Nature Center. And then ask questions like, what are they primarily interested, like why would they use that site and so on, before it gets down into asking particular, monetary value responses, which is a combination of set responses and then some other amount. So a bit of a hybrid approach there too. Okay, it's probably worth mentioning that contingent valuation, in many ways, it's a bit of a controversial method. The benefit is that it has the ability to try to capture people's monetary values for these non-use values, and we don't really have other ways of doing that very well. So that can be useful, but it is controversial because we're asking people hypothetical questions about things and they're kind of having to make hypothetical responses to them. So first off, just some of the different biases here. So for example, we could be asking people their willingness to pay for some environmental improvement or for the maintenance of some existing environmental attribute, or we'd be asking them how much would they be willing to accept in compensation if it were to be lost or degraded and so on. And what we find in practice is that people are far more basically people are more likely to be willing to people want more in compensation than they're willing to pay, put it that way. So if we ask, how much would you be willing to accept, those numbers always tend to be higher than how much they're willing to pay to preserve the same thing. So people don't like losing what they already have, and so compensation values always tend to be higher. And of course, you can imagine that they're being asked not so much what would they actually have to pay for from their budget, but rather how much would they get back in compensation. Those numbers tend to be higher. And we'd be more likely to use a willingness to pay when people are being the beneficiaries of some change. And we might be more likely to use the willingness to accept compensation when people are being disadvantaged. So for instance, a willingness to accept study that's been done in the past was when the Exxon Valdez spilled oil in Alaska, and then there was a survey used about how much should people be compensated. It used a willingness to accept approach there. So there's some other potential biases here, biases that are found in the research here, when we ask people these hypothetical questions. So one is a strategic answer bias. So what I mean by that is that respondents may deliberately misrepresent their willingness to pay or their willingness to accept in order to, for instance, manipulate the results of the survey. For example, if we ask people how much would they be willing to pay for preserving some small local park that has some koalas and so on, many people might say, well, around $100 or $200 a year, but you may have a particular respondent who is making a protest vote and really trying to manipulate the results, and they may say, well, I'd pay $40,000 a year to preserve that, and it may not be truly their willingness to pay, but it would certainly affect the results. You can imagine right away it would bring the average value up and result in a total value that would be greater than if that respondent hadn't said that. So there is approaches to identify those outliers and protest votes, but it's and other people may just not want to make that response because they think that a certain environmental attribute is priceless, and they have an ethical, moral objection to trying to put a dollar value on it. Another form of bias is a bidding bias or a range bias. So here, what basically we find in practice is that if I am asking people how much would they be willing to pay for some environmental asset, and then I start at $100 or I start at $10, right away it sets a context for people, and it will influence the types of responses that they will come up with. If I were to leave it to their own without actually proposing a number to begin with, they may have formulated something in the $150 range, but if I start it at $5 immediately, they may think, well, they're overvaluing it, they're kind of an outlier, and they may come right down. So that bidding bias is one. Another is the form of payment. So people will be influenced by whether or not the proposed payment would be made by an increase in their taxes or an increase in an entry fee, and also who would be administering that that payment and overseeing that funding. So for example, people tend to have more confidence in non-governmental organizations that have, transparency measures around them, and do not have an obvious kind of potential agenda. Also, sometimes government people are more suspicious sometimes about private sectors being responsible for environmental improvement. So that combination of how will they pay and who will oversee that funding mechanism influences the amount that people are willing to pay. Another bias is a mental accounting bias. So we're asking people to, on the spot, without too much consideration besides the scenario that we painted, make a decision about their willingness to pay. And that could be influenced, for instance, by, their feeling, the sentimental value that they might place on the environment generally, even if they've never visited that particular location. They may come up with numbers that are inconsistent with, the money that they actually have to do that. They may change, if you ask the same person in different months and so on, they may come up with different numbers. So it's a hypothetical question, and therefore we're kind of getting hypothetical answers that are subject to change. And another bias is this yay-saying bias, where the respondent may agree to a number that we put out there because they perceive it's like the correct answer that the researcher wants to hear. So if I say, "Would you be willing to pay $45?" Then they may think, that's the kind of, yes, I should be paying that, even if they might not really be willing to pay that if it were to actually have to occur. Okay, so let's look now just at a few more example studies. So here's an example study of tourists' willingness to pay for water clarity improvements on the Great Barrier Reef. And this particular study found that that tourists did appreciate water quality, that it was a kind of a subjective, that there were these different subjective measures of water quality and their satisfaction with the experience, and that there was concern about deterioration of water quality. And that this particular study found on average visitors would be willing to pay around $14.50 per visit to help improve the water quality on the Great Barrier Reef, but that differed between different kinds of visitors and their demographics. Here's one. This is an older one. This is back from 2001, and it looked at using willingness to pay to determine, how much might people be willing to pay for conservation of different endangered species. And in this case, it was in Victoria, and they looked at both the Leadbetter's possum and then, more broadly, some different other some different endangered flora and fauna. And they found that now they've aggregated this up, you can see. So they estimated, first off, that people would be willing to pay about $29 per household for the conservation of the possum, or more generally for the conservation of all endangered flora and fauna, around $118 per household. So again, this is mean household values, whereas previously I've talked about individual values, and then they aggregated those up. So this is really important. So then they're drawing this conclusion: $40 million per year for the conservation of the possum, and $160 million per year for the conservation of all endangered flora and fauna, is based on taking those average household values and multiplying them by all of the households in Victoria, right? So the total population then becomes quite important in terms of, when either you're doing this type of research or whether or not you're interpreting these types of studies, can we hold that the individuals that were surveyed were representative enough, and that that it could be fully expanded and aggregated over the entire state. Here's a different study that looked at increasing risk of water quality, especially ecological and health risks from wastewater flooding that would occur under increased flood conditions with climate change in Switzerland, and asked people's willingness to pay to reduce those risks, reduce the risk of health risks and ecological risks of sewers overflowing from into these rivers and lakes and then into the urban areas. And they found that 71% of respondents were willing to pay a higher annual tax, in this case $738 per year. Now this one was slightly different to the contingent valuation I've described so far. It's a choice experiment. I won't cover this I won't cover that method in this particular video, but small difference there about how that particular stated preference method study was done. Here is from the example I mentioned earlier, so consumer willingness to pay for organic and locally grown produce in Dominica. So the proposal was to have this, increasing agriculture revenue and, having an ecotourism kind of destination around sustainable agriculture in Dominica, and the proposal to convert all of the agriculture to organic production. And then it surveyed people and found that, the Dominican consumers were willing to pay, 7.5% more for organic and 12% more for locally grown produce than they would for the alternative. And again, you can see here this next section here, these results varied significantly, meaning statistically significantly, using that regression analysis I talked about earlier, across different demographic segments of the sample population, depending on health and family and so on, and whether or not they were kind of early adopters for new products. Okay, so here's one last one, and this was a willingness to pay survey for how much would people in Tianjin, China be willing to pay for green electricity, so for renewable energy. And of course, that would be part of a response to climate change on the mitigation side. And so they found in this case, using this combination of willingness to pay, regression, that according to the sample, so you can see the sample size here, about 468 respondents, most residents had a positive willingness to pay, which is they would be willing to pay something, and that the average value of that willingness to pay was 32.63 renminbi, Chinese currency, which equates to about $4.61 per month. And that the main driving factors of this willingness to pay were people's knowledge of renewable energy, their attitudes and beliefs towards the government, their behavior, their education, their own history and experience with respiratory diseases, based on the pollution in these centers, and their knowledge about how renewable energy might reduce air pollution. All other factors included income, disease, age, and gender, and so on. Interestingly, at the end, the males tended to have a higher willingness to pay than females. So all of these different socio and demographic factors then influenced people's willingness to pay. So it's important to note then that many studies, you can imagine any one of the studies that I've just looked at, or the overall method that I'm outlining here, would take a large amount of effort, time and resources to implement. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about benefit transfer, and benefit transfer is essentially when you don't have enough time to undertake this primary research, then you look to former studies like the ones I've just outlined here and see if you can use the values that came out of there, like the dollar values, for example, and apply them to some new site. So could we, for instance, take these measures for willingness to pay for green electricity in China and apply them in the Sunshine Coast, and conclude that they would be the same? And so hopefully right away you can see there's going to be issues with this in terms of the situation in China under which this study occurred would be very different than the situation that's occurring in the Sunshine Coast. Our air pollution is different. There's far less, urban densification. The cultural situation would be different. The dollars, there would be a kind of exchange kind of difference. There would be the differences in education and annual income and, attitudes toward the government, and all of those different things would be quite different. So we would need to exercise a high degree of caution in concluding that we could simply transfer over this US $44.61 per month, and that would be the same then in the Sunshine Coast. So in the next video, I'll talk in detail about the benefit transfer method. Okay, thanks for your time.